I've learned that some cases don't stay confined to evidence. They don't live only in files, reports, or courtroom transcripts. They spill out into conversation, into opinion, into the quiet spaces where people try to decide what they believe happened. They move into belief. Because when facts are incomplete, belief fills the gaps. We start weighing not just what we know, but what feels likely. What makes sense to us? What aligns with our instincts about people and behavior? They move into interpretation. Every detail becomes symbolic. Every inconsistency feels meaningful. Silence becomes suspicious. Calm becomes cold. We stop asking only what happened, and start asking what kind of person would do this. And that question is far more subjective than we like to admit. They move into how human beings make sense of uncertainty. Because uncertainty is uncomfortable. It leaves stories unfinished. It leaves pain unresolved. It asks us to sit with the possibility that we may never know the full truth. And most of us aren't wired for that. So we build narratives. We connect dots. We assign motives. We choose the version of events that feels most complete, even if it isn't fully proven. That's why cases like this linger. They don't just challenge the legal system, they challenge the way we think. About guilt. About doubt. About how much ambiguity we're willing to tolerate before we demand an answer. This is one of those cases. A case where the evidence points in directions, but never fully settles. A case where certainty feels close, but never quite reaches solid ground. And once a case crosses that line, from evidence into belief, it stops being just a legal matter. It becomes a mirror, reflecting how we, as people, respond when the truth refuses to arrive neatly wrapped. This is one of those cases. On the night of January 26, 2009, Bob Chappell was last seen alive on his yacht, Four Winds, moored on the River Derwent in Hobart, Tasmania. He was 65 years old, a medical physicist by profession. Careful, analytical, known for precision. That detail matters, because men like Bob Chappell tend not to vanish by accident. By morning, the yacht was in trouble, taking on water, listing low in the river. Investigators later concluded that a pipe had been cut, and a seacock deliberately opened. Someone had sabotaged the vessel. That much was clear. What wasn't clear was who did it, or why. Inside the yacht, police found traces of blood. Not the kind that screams violence. Not the kind that answers questions. Blood on the steps, blood on a torch, fragments. Enough to suggest something had gone wrong, but not enough to say exactly what. From the earliest hours of the investigation, attention turned toward Bob Chappell's partner of 18 years, Susan Neill-Fraser. That focus wasn't unusual. In missing person cases, the closest partner is always examined first. Access matters. Opportunity matters. History matters. But what happened next moved beyond procedure. It moved into perception. Susan was independent, accustomed to handling things herself, direct in her answers, not inclined to soften her words for comfort. She didn't volunteer emotion. She didn't dramatize her concern. She spoke plainly, sometimes awkwardly, and that stood out. She was unpolished in the way she spoke, not evasive, not theatrical, just blunt. In a situation where people expect vulnerability, bluntness can feel wrong, not illegal, not dishonest, but wrong in a way that triggers suspicion. She didn't perform grief the way people expect. That expectation matters more than we like to admit, because society has an unspoken script for how grief should look. It should be visible. It should be emotional. It should be immediate. Tears are trusted. Composure is questioned. When someone doesn't follow that script, people start searching for explanations. Is she cold? Is she detached? Is she hiding something? Those questions don't come from evidence. They come from discomfort. And once discomfort enters the room, interpretation follows. Every pause becomes meaningful. Every calm response feels calculated. Every imperfect sentence is replayed. Susan's demeanor didn't match the image people held of a grieving partner. And instead of adjusting the image became the standard. This is where expectation becomes dangerous. Because expectation isn't neutral. It's shaped by culture, by gender norms, by how we think women should respond to loss. When those expectations aren't met, Suspicion can grow quietly, not because of what someone has done, but because of how they're perceived. That doesn't mean Susan Neill-Fraser was innocent, and it doesn't mean she was guilty. It means something more subtle happened early on. The investigation didn't just follow evidence. It followed a feeling, a sense that something didn't fit. And once that sense takes hold, it has a way of guiding attention, even when the facts themselves remain incomplete. That's one of the hardest truths in cases like this. Sometimes the first thing that shapes an investigation isn't proof. It's expectation. And once expectation sets the frame, every piece of evidence that follows is seen through it. Susan gave police several accounts of her movements that night. She initially said she stayed home. Later said she went out. At one point, she claimed to have visited a Bunnings hardware store, a claim later shown to be false. Those inconsistencies became central, because when physical evidence is thin, behavior becomes evidence. By August 2009, Susan Neill-Fraser was arrested and charged with murder. No body had been found, no weapon recovered, no eyewitnesses, but the case moved forward. The prosecution built a narrative. They argued Susan killed Bob on the yacht, that she struck him with a wrench, used the yacht's winches to move his body, placed him in a dinghy, weighted him with a fire extinguisher, and dumped him into the river. Every step relied on inference. Each action assumed the previous one had occurred. This is important, because circumstantial cases are built like chains, and chains are only as strong as their weakest link. No wrench was ever found. No dinghy recovered. No body surfaced. The fire extinguisher theory was speculative, but the jury accepted the sequence. Why? Circumstantial evidence isn't lesser evidence, but it is different. It doesn't tell you what happened. It tells you what might have happened, if certain assumptions are true. In these cases, jurors aren't weighing facts alone. They're constructing stories. Humans are narrative thinkers. We don't like gaps. We don't tolerate unanswered questions well. When something terrible happens, the mind looks for coherence, and the most psychologically satisfying outcome is certainty. In circumstantial cases, jurors often ask, who had opportunity? Who behaved strangely? Who lied? And once a suspect fits that frame, every detail starts to point in one direction, even neutral ones. In Susan Neill-Fraser's case, several psychological factors came into play. Inconsistencies in her story, her calm demeanor, the sabotage of the boat, the absence of any other clear suspect. Together these created what psychologists call cumulative inference. Each piece feels small, but together, they feel convincing. This is where confirmation bias enters. Once jurors believe someone probably did it, they subconsciously reinterpret ambiguity as proof. Gaps stop being problems. They become assumed steps. Years later, forensic testing introduced a new element. DNA belonging to a 15-year-old homeless girl, Megan Voss, was found on the yacht's deck. That discovery shook the foundation of the case, because it suggested another presence, another possibility. Voss later signed an affidavit claiming she witnessed others attacking Bob Chappell, that Susan Neill-Fraser wasn't involved. For many, this was the missing piece, the alternative explanation. But then came the recantation. In court, Voss said she had never been on the yacht, that she was confused, pressured, manipulated. Her credibility collapsed, and with it, so did the strongest challenge to the conviction. Psychologically, this matters too, because once an alternative explanation fails, belief in the original story hardens. People think, if not that, then what else? And when no other answer emerges, the original verdict feels safer. Susan Neill-Fraser appealed repeatedly. Each appeal returned to the same questions. Is suspicion enough? Is inference enough? How much doubt is reasonable? In 2021, the Tasmanian Court of Criminal Appeal rejected her final major appeal. The decision was split. 2 judges said no retrial. 1 said yes. That matters, because it means the legal system itself wasn't unified in certainty. The High Court refused to hear the case. The conviction stood. Susan was released on parole in October 2022 after serving 13 years. But parole is not exoneration. She remains under supervision until 2032. and she is restricted from publicly proclaiming her innocence. Cases without bodies leave psychological residue. They sit unresolved in the public mind, because there's no final image, no physical closure. Just theory versus theory. Some people believe the jury was right, that Susan's lies mattered, that sabotage required intent, that coincidence has limits. Others believe this was a miscarriage of justice, that suspicion filled gaps, evidence never closed. Both views can't exist honestly. That's what makes this case so difficult. I'm Detective Pennyworth, and this is one of those cases that reminds you, circumstantial evidence doesn't just test facts. It tests how much uncertainty we're willing to live with. Because once a story feels complete, the human mind resists reopening it, even when doubt remains. If you want to stay with these cases, the ones that sit in the gray, you can subscribe to the channel. We'll keep telling the stories where answers are incomplete, but understanding how we reach conclusions matters just as much as the conclusions themselves.